That burger you had for lunch yesterday, the coffee that woke you up this morning, the rice in your pantry, the watermelon at your summer barbecue. Every single one of them has a secret so deeply buried that entire generations have lived and died without knowing the truth. What if I told you that the foods you consider American, European, or Asian actually came from a continent that's been systematically erased from history books, cookbooks, and dinner table conversations? What if I told you that the greatest food heist in human history happened right under our noses, and we've been celebrating the thieves ever since? This isn't about recipes. This is about identity stolen, knowledge erased, and an entire continent's contribution to your daily life hidden in plain sight. Because once you know where your food really comes from, you'll never look at your plate the same way again. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Right now, in kitchens across America, Europe, and Asia, millions of people are preparing meals with ingredients they think they know. But what if that history was rewritten? How did crops native to Africa end up being credited to European explorers? Who benefited from this massive historical cover-up? And most importantly, why has this been kept quiet for so long? To answer these questions, we need to go back, way back, to a time when food wasn't just sustenance. It was power, currency, and identity. Picture West Africa in the 1400s, before European ships ever touched its shores. The markets of Timbuktu, Lagos, and Kumasi weren't just trading posts. They were vibrant centers of agricultural innovation. Women balanced baskets of perfectly cultivated okra on their heads, the pods bright green and tender. Farmers displayed pyramids of yams so large that a single one could feed a family for days. Rice paddies stretched across the landscape, their irrigation systems so sophisticated that they would later be copied throughout the Americas. This wasn't primitive farming. This was science. African farmers had spent thousands of years developing drought-resistant crops, understanding soil nutrition, and creating varieties of plants that could survive in harsh conditions. In Ethiopia, coffee wasn't just a drink. It was a ceremony, a spiritual practice that brought communities together. The beans were roasted fresh, ground by hand, and brewed in clay pots. Meanwhile, in what is now Nigeria, pepper traders were crossing the Sahara Desert with spices so valuable they were literally worth their weight in gold. In ancient Egypt, brewing beer wasn't a hobby, it was an industry. Workers building the pyramids were paid partially in beer, which was so nutritious it was considered food. The brewers, mostly women, had perfected techniques for fermentation that wouldn't be understood by European science for another 3,000 years. Across the continent, indigenous peoples had domesticated dozens of crops: black-eyed peas, watermelon, sorghum, millet, coffee, kola nuts, sesame, tamarind, and countless varieties of leafy greens. Each one represented generations of careful cultivation and knowledge passed down through families. Now, here's what makes this remarkable. While Europe was struggling through repeated famines, plagued by poor agricultural practices and limited crop diversity, Africa was thriving. European diets were monotonous, often dangerous. Bread made from grain so poorly stored it caused poisoning, meat that rotted quickly, vegetables that barely grew in rocky soil. But in Africa, there was abundance. There was variety. There was knowledge that could have changed the world, if only it had been shared fairly. Instead, it was taken. The year was 1526, and a ship called the Sceau Viceni was preparing to leave the coast of present-day Senegal. Its cargo wasn't just human beings torn from their families. The cargo also included something else: seeds. Hidden in the braided hair of enslaved women were rice seeds, okra seeds, sesame seeds. Tucked into the hems of clothing were watermelon seeds. These weren't accidents. These were deliberate acts of resistance and preservation. Women who knew they were being taken from their homeland forever made the conscious decision to bring Africa with them. They carried their culture, their knowledge, their identity in the form of seeds. The ship's captain kept a detailed log. One entry, dated June 14, 1526, read something that would chill you when you understand its implications. He wrote, "The women carry more than we bargained for. They carry the taste of Africa in their hands. We shall profit from this knowledge." He knew. They all knew. The value wasn't just in the labor these people would be forced to provide. It was in what they knew. How to grow rice in flooded fields. How to cultivate okra in hot climates. how to cook with limited ingredients and still create food that nourished and sustained. Within decades, rice plantations across South Carolina and Georgia were using West African farming techniques, not European methods, African methods. The enslaved people were forced to recreate the irrigation systems they had known back home, the same systems their ancestors had perfected over centuries. And the plantation owners took credit for every single innovation. When okra began appearing in Southern cooking, it was called a New World vegetable. But okra is African. Its name comes from the Igbo word kr. The plant had been cultivated in West Africa for thousands of years before a single European ever tasted it. Enslaved cooks were bringing Africa to American tables, one meal at a time. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. European colonizers weren't just taking the crops. They were systematically erasing Africa's connection to them. Coffee, which had been cultivated in Ethiopia for over 1,000 years, was suddenly being credited to Arab traders. Rice became an Asian crop in the historical record. Black-eyed peas became Southern food with no acknowledgement of where they came from. The pattern was clear. Take the knowledge, take the crops, erase the source. One woman, whose name was never recorded but who we'll call Sarah, was known on a Virginia plantation for her cooking skills. According to letters between plantation owners, Sarah could make a feast from nothing and season food in ways that bewitched the tongue. What they were describing was West African cuisine. Sarah was using techniques her mother had taught her, techniques passed down through generations. She was creating dishes that would later be called Southern cuisine, soul food. But Sarah's name appears nowhere in the cookbooks that would later claim these recipes as their own. If you're still watching, type Taste of Africa in the comments. Let's see who's uncovering the real story. How many meals have you eaten that carried African origins without you knowing? How does that make you feel? By the 1700s, cookbooks were being published at an unprecedented rate, but there was a problem. Many recipes, especially those from the American South and Caribbean, were obviously African in origin. The ingredients, the techniques, the flavor combinations, they all pointed back to West and Central Africa. So what did the cookbook authors do? They simply didn't mention where the recipes came from. A dish that enslaved cooks had been preparing for decades would appear in a cookbook attributed to a white plantation mistress. Techniques that required generations of knowledge were presented as new innovations by European chefs. The most famous example is gumbo, a dish so fundamentally African that its very name gives away its origins. Gumbo comes from the West African word for okra, kingombo. The dish itself is a direct descendant of West African okra soups, but in American cookbooks, gumbo was presented as Creole cuisine with barely a mention of Africa. The same happened with jambalaya, which bears a striking resemblance to jollof rice, a West African dish made for over 1,000 years. The cooking method is identical. The spice profiles are similar, but American culinary history presents jambalaya as if it spontaneously developed in Louisiana. In Charleston, Hoppin' John became a New Year's tradition. Black-eyed peas cooked with rice. Eating it was supposed to bring good luck. This wasn't a Southern tradition. This was West African. Black-eyed peas had been considered lucky in West Africa long before Charleston existed. Meanwhile, in Europe, colonial powers encountered crops and agricultural practices far superior to their own. European botanists began documenting these discoveries, but they positioned themselves as the discoverers, as if these crops had been waiting in Africa for Europeans to find them. One French botanist in Senegal in 1749 wrote extensively about sophisticated rice cultivation. He noted the irrigation systems, the seed selection, the timing of planting. His writing showed clear admiration. But when published in Paris, the framing changed. The African farmers became primitive people who stumbled upon these practices by accident. Coffee provides the most egregious example. Coffee is Ethiopian. The plant is native to the Ethiopian highlands. Ethiopians discovered its properties, developed the practice of roasting and brewing, and created the coffee ceremony still practiced today. They've been drinking coffee for over 1,000 years, but somewhere along the way, the narrative changed. Coffee became an Arab contribution. The story most people learn is that Arab traders brought coffee to Yemen, where it spread to the Ottoman Empire and Europe. Ethiopia is left out entirely. Why? Because crediting Africa with something as significant as coffee didn't fit the narrative that European colonizers wanted to tell. That narrative required Africa to be primitive, a place with nothing to offer except raw materials and labor. So the story was changed. And for centuries, people believed it. In 2003, a historian named Michael Thompson was researching plantation records in South Carolina when he stumbled across a diary written by a plantation owner's wife in 1790. One entry dated September 3, 1790, changed everything he thought he knew. She wrote, "Today I watched Patience, one of the kitchen women, prepare the rice in a manner I had never before witnessed." She claims this is how her grandmother taught her in their homeland. The rice was first soaked, then steamed in a woven basket suspended over boiling water. The result was the finest rice I have ever tasted. I have tried to replicate this method with my own hands but cannot achieve the same result. There is knowledge in her fingers that I do not possess. This entry directly acknowledged African expertise. It described a cooking technique still used in West African cuisine today. It admitted that this knowledge couldn't simply be copied. Michael found more diaries, more letters. A pattern emerged. Across the American South, there were countless written acknowledgments of African culinary expertise. But these acknowledgments existed only in private writings. They never made it into published books or public discourse. Why? Because acknowledging African expertise would undermine the entire justification for slavery. Let's talk about what Africa actually gave the world. Coffee is Ethiopian. Every cup consumed anywhere traces back to Ethiopia. The global coffee industry, worth over $100 billion, exists because of African knowledge. Watermelon is African, cultivated there for over 5,000 years. Okra is African, from around Ethiopia. Black-eyed peas are African, domesticated in West Africa. Sesame seeds are African, cultivated for over 3,000 years. Sorghum is African, domesticated around 8,000 years ago. Kola nuts are African, the original ingredient that gave Coca-Cola its name. Yams are African, cultivated for over 5,000 years. But it's not just crops, it's techniques. Fermentation practices perfected in Africa are now used in everything from yogurt to sourdough bread. Spice blending techniques common in North and West Africa influence cuisines worldwide. Rice cultivation in flooded paddies was practiced in West Africa centuries before European contact. Deep frying was common in West Africa long before other culinary traditions adopted it. Think about that. Food became a form of resistance. When enslaved people cooked African dishes, they were preserving their identity. Fish and chips, fried chicken. The technique has African roots. Every bite of these globally beloved foods carries African knowledge. But Africa's contribution has been systematically erased. Despite centuries of erasure, the knowledge survived. It survived in the kitchens of enslaved people who taught their children in secret. It survived in African American communities who kept traditions alive. Food became a form of resistance. When enslaved people cooked African dishes, they were preserving their identity. When they passed recipes down, they were saying, "This is who we are." They may have taken everything else, but they cannot take this. One woman we'll call Ruth, whose great-grandmother had been enslaved in Georgia, told a researcher in 1936, "My granny cooked for the white folks. But Sunday, when we had our own time, she cooked for us the way her mama taught her. She made the okra soup, the black-eyed peas, the rice just so. And she'd tell us, 'This food is your history. Long as you know how to make this food, you know who you are.'" Food as identity, food as resistance, food as memory. Today, there's a reclamation happening. African diaspora chefs are publicly acknowledging the African roots of soul food, Creole cuisine, Caribbean cooking. Historians are tracing these culinary connections and giving credit where it's due. Chef Michael Twitty has spent years documenting the African roots of Southern food, tracing dishes back to specific regions of Africa. Chef Pierre Thiam is bringing traditional West African dishes to American audiences and drawing connections between West African food and dishes Americans already love. Dr. Jessica Harris has written extensively about the African diaspora's influence on world cuisine. These are people doing the work of reclamation, of truth-telling. Now, here's the twist that brings everything full circle. Let's talk about fried chicken. Fried chicken is as American as it gets, right? Wrong. Fried chicken is African. West Africans had been frying chicken in palm oil with complex spice blends long before the transatlantic slave trade. When enslaved Africans were forced to cook in the American South, they combined their traditional frying techniques with available ingredients. What emerged was the fried chicken we know today. Crispy, perfectly seasoned fried chicken. That came from African culinary knowledge. Every piece of fried chicken sold at every restaurant, cooked in home kitchens worldwide, it all traces back to Africa. But how often is that acknowledged? Almost never. So now you know. Your morning coffee is Ethiopian. Your watermelon is West African. Your black-eyed peas, okra, sesame seeds, all African. The fried chicken you love, the gumbo, the jambalaya, all of it has African roots that were deliberately hidden from you. How does this make you feel? Does it change how you think about the food on your plate? Does it make you angry that this history was hidden? And here is a deeper question. If something you've been enjoying your whole life came from a culture you knew nothing about, does that change your responsibility to acknowledge it, to honor it? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which food surprised you the most. Tell me how you feel knowing this history, because this conversation matters. If this story made you think, hit that subscribe button, because the food story doesn't end here. There are more dishes with hidden histories, more crops with erased origins. Next time, we're looking at another food that shaped world history, another dish disconnected from its true origins. And when you find out the truth, it will change how you see global food culture forever. The plate in front of you isn't just food, it's history, it's culture, it's memory, and it's time we knew the truth about where it all really came from. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.